Hello and welcome to this Calligraphy with Kevin tutorial. Today we'll be writing the project Springtime is Here. So thanks for joining me. Grab some paper and a pen or pencil. If you have some fancy writing utensils, all the better. I'll just be walking you through this project. Enjoy. And here we go. So again, this is our project, and this script is Spencerian script compared to, well, I'll give you an example. This is copperplate script, where there's a lot more thick sections compared to Spencerian script. The thick downstrokes are more sparse, right? So it makes them pop out a little bit more to the eye. And there's also a different letter shape. It's very similar, but the letter shape of the individual letters has a little, I think, a crisper edge to it. Anyway. So if you have your pencil and paper or pen and paper handy, we're going to start with some basic letter forms just to practice from the top. And we're going to spend a lot of time going over the S. The Spencerian S is one of the more challenging letters I think I've ever tried to practice. But watch me do a few of them. And they're not going to be perfect, but I'll go ahead. By the way, if I'm starting from this is height, and so my paper has been grid lined out where I have a larger, like 1/3 is going to be the shape of a lowercase letter, for example, an A. And then I have 2/3 of a space above that for capital or majuscule letters. So that's where that comes into play for me. And if I start to draw an S in this script, and there's, a ton of different ways to write a capital letter. That's the gist of what I'm going for. So to break that down, here's your first task. I want you to start a little bit higher than halfway up the dimensions that you're going to use for the height of your capital letter, and make an oval that does that has a tail on the right side edge of it. And we're just going to repeat that shape by itself a number of times. And so if I were to bisect this oval, I'm looking for the axis to be horizontal. Does that make sense? Rather than for my A over here, the axis to my A is on my diagonal. So that's the first flourish to the letter S. And then let's go ahead and add to it. If I start again down here, That's the first part. My oval is horizontally oriented. When I come up to the top and then I dive back down, and because I have a fancy writing utensil, I can make a bubble of ink there. But then I come back up to the top, and I'm going to aim for kind of 3 different points. First, I want to hit almost the middle of my first oval, and then I want to come back around and I want to leave a gap right there as I come back around and finish that off. And on that one, honestly, I don't like how large this section is, so I'm going to try that again. I start with that oval. Yeah, I like that one a little better. And so I'm still practicing, remember. So this area is going to depend on kind of the aesthetics of the letter. And you'll notice from my different strokes that surface area is different from every one that I draw. And that's what happens with practice. You figure it out and you get better at consistency. But that's my general shape. I'm going to keep going across the page and then I'll ask if we need clarification. If you happen to have diagonal grid lines, some of these are better than others, but I'm trying to make my downstroke mostly parallel that diagonal grid line right here. But then I peel off again to the left. Is anyone left-handed, by the way? Just shout if you are. And if you are, I don't have much advice for you because I'm not left-handed. But do we need more practice? Or you know, comments, tips on what I'm aiming for as a shape and how how large to make the ovals. I will say with this, my second loop over here, I want it to be at least as far and preferably a little bit farther to the left than my first loop. Yeah, so it has the weight of that larger oval is to the left. I'm going to do just a few more of those, and then unless I hear otherwise, I'll go right into the next couple of lowercase letters.
So when you use one of those fancy calligraphy pens, does it change? I mean, is it better to just get one and start practicing with that in the first place, or?
If you are interested in calligraphy and pointed nib calligraphy, I would say this is a very worthy investment. The pen holder is $15 or $20, and this is an oblique pen holder. And so this nib, I don't want to get my fingers inky, but this nib comes out of this holder, and I happen to have a little spring in there which collects the ink. And so I dip this in my inkwell, and that spring captures or holds more ink, so I don't have to dip every couple strokes. But let me show you by way of example another nib. And so this is just an empty nib. I don't have it attached to anything, but the fine point of it is really fine. And the way I create a bubble of ink is by applying pressure. And you can see that it splays the two times, and that's what allows ink to fill that larger gap. And when I release
it depends on the amount of pressure that you apply.
Correct.
Okay.
So I can make, if I do some diagonal strokes, I can choose, where to put that pressure and how large of a splay to make it.
That's cool.
And that's the beautiful thing of pointed nib calligraphy is your connection to the pen, your connection to the paper, how much pressure you apply. And that's really where the skill comes in that I'm still developing. But it is a beautiful experience. Yeah.
Cool.
But if you don't have a fancy nib, after you draw the letter shape by itself, you can go back in and shade,
Okay.
thicken up different aspects of the letter. Yeah. And when I sketch out an idea with a pencil, that's what I'll do. And then when I go back and practice it with actual ink, I'll try to make those thick and thin strokes appear where I've shaded them in the pencil. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and go on to our P. So just practice a number of these. And the Spencerian script in particular has this shape to the P. Everything starts with an upstroke, which is going to go, this is called the X height. So the height of my lowercase letters is an X height. And I start from left to right, and I cover that ground. And that's a very standard stroke. But for the P, it's going to elevate above the X height by another third at least. And then the second stroke is a downstroke that stays thin until I get close to the bottom where I apply more pressure to my nib to make it bubble up. And then the third piece of it is to come back up from the bottom of the X height, and rather than attach all the way, it does a partial attachment. And so by itself, that might not look like a P, but in the context of another word, it does. So altogether, this is a 2 or 3 stroke letter. My X height, or my entry stroke begins. I take it above the X height, I draw it back down, make it thicker at the bottom, and then I release my pen, come back up to the top of the X height, curve around, and finish with an exit stroke. I'll continue, I'll write 2 or 3 more of those just for practice. And again, I'm aiming to parallel, so that when I happen to have a guideline right on it, that I could just parallel the whole way down. And that really helps my consistency. Okay, I'm gonna go into an R. And in Spencerian script, it's all a very thin spider stroke. My entry stroke is the same. And I go above the X height again, one more time. I loop around, and then I have a very small finish before my exit stroke. I mean, so it's a cursive R, but the guidelines help give me shape to it. And it's very intentional in its speed. But I guess I should say this, the formation of the Spencerian script is meant to be written faster once you get good at it. Like the United States Constitution or the Declaration of Independence is written in Spencerian script. Okay, I'm gonna go into my eye, and fairly simple. The entry stroke begins just as everything else. And this time I lift my pen at the top of the X height, and I'm going to apply a thick downstroke. And then I release my pressure to give it an exit stroke. Entry to the top of the baseline, or the X height. The baseline is the bottom of this X height. Thick pressure, release up to the top. And if you happen to have, well, and even with a pencil, rather than land right on top, let's see if I can tease out the difference between these two. If I apply my downstroke right on top of my entry stroke, it's going to change the shape. Do you see how that's where that line meets my entry stroke? As opposed to the one before, it meets my entry stroke a little bit higher. And so what I'm trying to do is start my downstroke at the right edge of my entry stroke. And that helps build consistency, but it's also a kind of an aesthetic look of the script itself. And your dots, you have some options on the dots. On the Spencerian script, I find that a sharper dot, almost like a teardrop, looks a little better. So with my writing utensil, I'm going to apply pressure at the very start of my drop and then flick it down and release as I come out of it. And it gives it that teardrop shape. Questions on any of this? Okay, to move on to an N. So my N is going to stay a thin idea. Entry stroke goes up the top of the X height and comes right back down. That's the first part, and then I start where I finished and make another one, and it exits. It is two separate strokes, and I want this space to be the same as this space. So the two bubbles of my N should be the same.
Hey, Kevin, I'm using some guidelines like yours, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you'll be able to see it well enough in mine. Should I keep my, do you see on mine how it has those blocks on the edges?
Yes.
Should I keep, is that the X height, like where that tiny little space, or should I go to the middle row?
To me, that looked like the X height.
Okay.
Just based on that quick glance.
Okay.
Yeah. And is that a pointed nib guideline paper? Okay, then yeah, that's probably the X height. I'm going to move on to a G. So this G, my entry stroke, rather than finishing at the angle of my italic guideline, is going to peel to the right just a little bit. It starts, I want the parallel aspect of it to be there, but then I do carve it off to the right a little bit to create the top of my G. And so the next stroke will come down alongside that. And it's a thick stroke on this one. I'm just going to do that by itself a few times. Entry stroke, hits the top of the X height by going to the right, and then I finish my G. And if every once in a while, I don't know if this is entirely correct, but often in this script, I don't connect those two lines. There's a slight gap, and I think that's okay. Okay, so the second piece of it, I'm going to do a downstroke that parallels, and by the time I get to the bottom of my descender height, is what that's called, I'm going to apply downward pressure and loop back to the left, and then come through. Okay, questions on that? And so you notice the aesthetic look of that. The left belly of the G is thicker, but then the right descender is thicker. And so it has this weighted thick to thick, thin to thin, opposing side aesthetic. That's part of the cool nature of this script. Okay, I'm gonna go on to a T, which is very similar to an I. My entry stroke is as it was for almost everything else so far. And then I'm going to start the top of my T, which does have a thick descender, about halfway up the, well, halfway above my X height. I'm going to come down, aim for the right edge of that, just like I did for the I. And then my T cross stroke happens just a little bit above the X height. Entry stroke, I go a little bit above that. I'm going to aim for the right edge of that, release my pressure, and then finish with the exit stroke. Okay, we've already done an I. So I'm going to go into an M and an E. My M is going to start the same way that an N does. I just add one more loop to it. And then my E, I think if I was actually in a professional calligraphy workshop, I would get in trouble here, but I think this specific Spencerian script E is one stroke, and it has that look to it, which is a really shallow bubble inside of the E. But because I'm practicing and I use the rest of my letter to help me, what I end up doing usually is this. I make it a two-part letter, which is more copperplate style, because that's what I'm used to. But it helps me stay more consistent, I think. But that's just me.
Can you get a pointed nib pen at the university bookstore?
They sell the pointed nibs, but they don't sell the oblique pen holder. So
Okay.
I'm going to drop in the chat a link to John Neal Bookseller, or John Neal Books. If you go check that place out, you'll find all kinds of stuff.
Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. Switch sheets, and we have by now gotten through the entire word of springtime. So I'm going to go ahead and write it as if we were writing it for our project. Just watch this first round, and then I'll describe how we tie everything together. So there it is. You first comment, the entry stroke, or rather the exit stroke from something like my P becomes the entry stroke for my R. And just as cursive writing does that, same application in pointed nib calligraphy, the exit stroke from my R becomes the entry stroke for my I, and that's what blends everything together. When I get to my second I don't know if you noticed, my first I was thick because it had been a while since a thick stroke appeared throughout these letters, and I want to maintain a sense of balance. So if I have a thick G and a thick T and a thick I, in my I, that's going to be too much thick in the same time. So I left my second I thin in order to give it that aesthetic balance of pressure. And then my M, that's 3 vertical strokes that don't have any thickness to them. So I'm going to make my E purposefully thick and dive below the baseline to give it that larger flourish. Oops, you couldn't see that. Sorry. I'll do it again. Or I have to move my tripod for a second. So as I was speaking, that's what I was trying to point out as I was doing it. The P has some pressure to it at the bottom, and then it's balanced with a thicker I, G, a thicker T, and then a thin I, M with a thick E to finish. Well, Kira, thanks for the extra link. It's new to me. It's cool.
There's some really good books on there too. I got a good copperplate book there.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. Yeah, book learning. That's how I've learned everything I know. Cool. I'm going to go ahead and write that word one more time. Practice along with me or do your own thing, and then we'll keep going. So there it is, springtime. I'm gonna go into the next word is just by itself. We'll practice it. I'll go ahead and blend it together right away. I'm gonna keep a thin I on this one. And my S goes up to the top of the X height, and it feels very similar to an R. Like that all is the same to an R, but I'm gonna keep going and I'm gonna make a thin belly to my S and come back up to my diagonal stroke and finish it right there. And then my exit stroke is a separate stroke to complete the letter. Okay, I'm gonna jump on and go to the H. Is that okay? The H is a little more complicated. I know the majuscule letters are always more complicated, but they're fun at the same time. The shape of that first oval is going to be the same as the shape of the first oval to my S. So here's my attempt at that. But this time I'm going to come closer to where I started. I might even touch it. I might not. It's okay if you do or don't. But I'm going to come pretty close to the top of the top of my height there. And then I'm going to do a diagonal line down and curve back around to bisect my H. Like so. And I come back up, trying to match my guideline angle there. And I curve back around and do a thin first oval and a thicker flourish. And here's also what I'm going for. I want the general shape and thickness of that second flourish to match the flourish and the shape of my E, to give that some balance as I put the whole project together. But I'm going to do that letter by itself lots of more times. And this is a single stroke letter. I do not lift the pen in this one, which makes it kind of fun.
That one's the hardest.
The loop is the hardest?
The H is the
Or
hardest.
the H letter by itself?
Yeah. You make it look easy though.
Well, thank you. I made a mistake on that last one. I don't know if you caught it. My right side edge there, I was in the habit of a copperplate script has a thick right side edge, so I started to apply some pressure when I didn't need to. I want that first stroke to be thin, and then my flourishing finish is thick.
I'm finding myself doing thick downstrokes like all over the place.
Yeah, all over. Yeah. Which is not a bad habit to get into. I think copperplate is a really pretty script. I'll do a few more H's because we don't have, we only have 2 letters left after that. We've done them both before. We start tying everything together. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. I have HERE is what I'm gonna finish here. And I just had this thick stroke. So my first E, I'm going to make a thin one. My R is gonna stay thin. And then my second E, I want it to be thick, but I want it to have the same shape as I did on my H and as I did on my other E. So I'll do that whole word one more time. And I think that has a nice balance. That's good. Okay, I'm gonna write springtime is here all across this next line, and it should take up pretty much all of my space here. You can watch along, certainly, or practice from the top, or practice on a trouble spot. And if we have questions before we start to flourish it up a little bit, we'll do that next. Okay, so that's the gist. And as I was sketching this out, I played with orientation, putting springtime on top of here, or playing with what I wanted that to look like. And sometimes just simple is better. I just thought I'd keep it, just keep it clean, write it all on one long line, and now we're going to play with some flourishing. So here are some flourishing options. We'll do simple first. And again, I have a fancy writing utensil, which makes that pop out a little bit. But those, these lines, again, keeping it simple. You can shade as you wish if you have a pencil, but here's how I go about those. If I think of my middle line, I want to eyeball the middle. I'm going to give it a shape that looks like this. I'm going to start with a thin stroke and then curve around with I'm going to end a little bit thicker on the left edge. So that's in the middle, and then I'm going to make 3 of them. So I'm going to start kind of about here and do the same thing. And then I'm going to do the same thing such that I finish over there. And that gives it that bottom side. And then I would do the same thing on top. I don't have space to do it over there, but I flip my paper upside down and would do the same thing. And just to, it's already written, but if I were to ghost over those lines, 1, 2, 3, turn it upside down and do the same thing. And then I'm going to give you some other ideas for some more springtime specific flourishy stuff. So I'm going to turn my page so that the X height guidelines are running toward me directly. They're pointing at my chest. And I'm going to make this foundational vine flourish. Let me get it in view first. I'm going to draw my pencil or my pen straight down towards me, but I'm going to curve a little bit above and then make a small loop. Curve a little bit below, make a small loop. Above, loop, below. And just work my way down the page. And, you know, I think that by itself looks pretty nice. And then we can add stuff to it, such as, again, let me make sure you can see it. At the concave surface over here, I'm going to draw a little leaf with a bubble leaf. And then on the other side, I'm going to keep a thin stroke and actually draw a little thicker teardrop leaf. And I'm going to alternate those two things. So on this side, there's a teardrop. On this side, there's a leaf. And vice versa. And so if I put that vine underneath my whole springtime is here, it gives it a little greenery, especially if you have some colored ink and so on and so forth. Questions about that? All right, so what I'm going to do next is try it without grid lines. I just have an empty sheet. I'm going to write my project and from top to finish and draw a little flourish, a little flowery flourish on each edge. And then pretty much we'll be done after that. But we have, you know, it's 4:17 right now. We've got a few more minutes. But here I go.